The recording chamber aboard the Galactic Archive station was cold and quiet. The lights were dim, set low to protect the sensitive eyes of the old alien who sat in the center of the room. Historian Veltanos checked her equipment one more time. The translation device was working. The recording crystals were active. Everything was ready. Across from her sat Commander Krixmar of the Selenari Empire. He was old now. His scales faded from the bright blue of his youth to a dull gray. 3 of his 4 eyes were closed forever, burned shut by human weapons during what the galaxy now called the Human Wars. His body was covered in scars, each one telling a story of battles fought long ago. Krixmar had refused to speak about the war for 40 standard cycles. Historians, journalists, and researchers had begged him for interviews. He had turned them all away. But today, something had changed. Today, he had finally agreed to share his memories. Veltanos looked at the old commander with respect. He had been one of the greatest military minds in Selenari history. Now he was just a tired old soldier carrying the weight of terrible memories. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with me," Veltanos said softly. Krixmar nodded slowly. His remaining eye, still sharp, despite his age, focused on her. "You wish to know about the humans," he said. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together. The young races always do. They see humanity now. Peaceful traders. Friendly diplomats. They shake hands with human ambassadors and share meals with human merchants. They cannot understand why we veterans flinch when we see them. He paused, and Veltanos saw something flash in his eye. Fear, after all these years. The fear was still there. "I was a battalion commander when we first encountered them," Krixmar continued. "The Selenari Empire was the greatest power in this region of the galaxy. We had conquered 37 species. 37 worlds had bent their knees to our emperor. We had never known defeat. Not once in 3,000 years of conquest." He laughed bitterly. "We were so proud, so confident. We thought ourselves invincible." Veltanos remained silent, letting the old soldier speak at his own pace. "When our scouts discovered the human homeworld, they sent back detailed reports. The humans had primitive technology. They had barely managed to put colonies on their own moon in a neighboring planet. Their weapons were crude. Their ships were slow. By every measure we used to judge a species, they were weak." Krixmar shook his head slowly. "We were fools. We looked at their technology and saw weakness. We should have looked at their history and seen the truth." "What truth?" Veltanos asked. "That humans are not like other species. They do not think like us. They do not fight like us. They do not surrender like us." The old commander's voice grew heavy. "We learned this lesson on Kepler 442b. That was where I met a human soldier named Danny Hawkins." He stopped speaking for a moment, and Veltanos saw his hands begin to shake. Danny Hawkins was the first human I ever saw up close. He was not particularly large or strong. He was not impressive by human standards. Just an ordinary soldier, they told me later. One of millions in their army. But what he did on Kepler 442b taught me more about humanity than any intelligence report ever could. Grix. Mar reached for a glass of water and drank slowly before continuing. Kepler 442b was a human colony world. About 300,000 humans lived there. Farmers, mostly. Scientists studying the local plants and animals. Families with children. It was a peaceful place. They had no real military presence. Just a small defense force with outdated weapons. We expected the conquest to be simple. We had done it so many times before. Land our troops, destroy any resistance, round up the survivors, and add another world to our empire. The whole operation was supposed to take 3 rotations, maybe 4. The old soldier's eye closed for a moment. When he opened it again, it was filled with ghosts. We were wrong. We were so terribly wrong. "Tell me about Danny Hawkins," Veltanos said gently. Krixmar nodded. "We captured him on the 3rd day of the invasion. He was part of a small unit that had been attacking our supply lines. Just 10 humans against our entire army? They should have run. They should have hidden and waited for rescue. Instead, they kept fighting. We killed 9 of them. Hawkins was the only survivor. He was wounded badly, burns over most of his body, several broken bones. He should have been dead. Any Selenari soldier with those injuries would have died within hours. But when we dragged him into the interrogation chamber, he was still conscious, still aware, still defiant. Krixmar's voice dropped to almost a whisper. I was the one who questioned him. I wanted to know where the other resistance fighters were hiding. I wanted to know how many more human soldiers had escaped our initial attack. Simple questions. Easy questions. Any rational being would have answered them. He paused again, and Veltanos waited. Danny Hawkins looked at me with those strange human eyes. 2 eyes like they all have, but so full of something I had never seen before. Later, I learned the word for it. Determination. Will. The refusal to stop fighting no matter what. He said 4 words to me, 4 simple words that I have never forgotten. Veltanos leaned forward. What did he say? Krixmar met her gaze directly. He said, you have no idea. I did not understand what he meant. I thought he was confused from his injuries. I thought he was delirious. So I asked him what he meant. The old commander shuddered. He smiled at me. A dying man, burned and broken, smiled at me like I was a child who had wandered into a predator's den without knowing the danger. And he said, you think you are conquerors? You think you know war? But you have never fought humans. You have no idea what we can do. You have no idea what we are willing to do. You have started something you cannot finish, and by the time you understand your mistake, it will be too late. Krixmar fell silent for a long moment. Danny Hawkins died 3 hours later from his injuries. He never told us anything useful. He never begged for mercy. He never showed fear. He just smiled that terrible smile and waited for death like an old friend. I thought he was just a madman, a fanatic. I thought his words were the ravings of a dying mind. The old soldier shook his head slowly. It took me 8 months to understand that everything he said was true. Every single word. Veltanos checked her recording equipment. Everything was still working perfectly. What happened in those 8 months? She asked. Krixmar looked at her with his scarred face and his single remaining eye. The humans taught us the true meaning of war, and we learned that there are some species in this galaxy that should never be challenged. Some species that carry the fire of survival in their very souls. Some species that will not stop fighting until they have one, or until every last one of them is dead. He leaned back in his chair, exhaustion written across his features. In those 8 months, Commander, the humans showed us what they really were, and we learned to be afraid. Krixmar stared at the wall of the recording chamber for a long moment before he continued his story. The memories were painful, but they needed to be told. The young races needed to understand what humanity truly was. The invasion of Kepler-4 to be was supposed to be simple, he said slowly. We had done this many times before. 37 species had fallen to our armies. 37 worlds had learned to bow before the Selenari Empire. We had a system. A method. It always worked. Got it. Veltanos listened carefully, her recording devices capturing every word. First, we would destroy their orbital defenses. Then we would bomb their major cities. Then we would land our ground forces to eliminate any remaining resistance. Finally, we would round up the survivors and begin the process of integration into our empire. Simple, clean, efficient. The old commander shook his head bitterly. The humans did not follow our expectations. They refused to play by our rules. And that was when the nightmare began. He described the first week of the invasion. The Selenari fleet had easily destroyed the small human defense stations orbiting the planet. Their bombers had flattened the main cities within hours. Everything was going according to plan. We landed 50,000 soldiers on the surface. Elite troops. The best warriors in our empire? They were confident, eager for glory. They expected the humans to surrender within days. Krixmar remaining, I grew distant, seeing battles fought long ago. The first night we lost 2,000 soldiers. We did not understand how. Our perimeter defenses were intact. Our sensors showed no enemy movement. But in the morning, we found our soldiers dead in their sleeping quarters. Throats cut. Silent kills. No alarms. No warnings? Nothing. He shuddered at the memory. We increased our patrols. We doubled our guards. We activated every sensor and scanner we had. It did not matter. The second night, we lost another 1,500. The third night, almost 2,000 more. How? Beltanos asked, genuinely confused. How could they get past your defenses? They did not go past our defenses. They went under them, through them, around them. The humans knew their world better than we ever could. They knew every cave, every tunnel, every hidden path. While we sat in our fortified bases, they moved like ghosts through the darkness. Krixmar spoke of a human soldier named Patricia Cole. She was small, even by human standards. The Selenari intelligence report said she was a farming colonist before the war. A simple woman who grew crops and raised animals. Nothing special. Nothing dangerous. We called her the Ghost of Kepler, the old commander said quietly. She led a unit of about 30 humans. Farmers, teachers, shopkeepers, ordinary people with no military training. Within 2 months, they had killed more than 4,000 of my soldiers. He described one particular night that still haunted his dreams. Patricia Cole and her unit had infiltrated the main Selenari command base. They had crawled through drainage pipes for 6 hours to reach the center of the complex. They killed 47 officers in 12 minutes. My senior commanders. My tactical advisors. My communications specialists. Patricia Cole personally eliminated General Vrixter, the leader of our ground forces. She used a blade made from a broken piece of farming equipment. Krixmar's hands were shaking again. When we reviewed the security recordings, we could not believe what we saw. This small human woman moved through our soldiers like wind through grass. She was faster than anything we had ever seen. Not because she was stronger or better equipped, but because she was fighting for her home, for her family, for her world. And that gave her a power we could not match. The old soldier explained how the humans changed their tactics constantly. Every time the Selenari found a way to counter one threat, the humans invented something new. When we used thermal imaging to find them at night, they covered themselves in mud and cold water to hide their heat signatures. When that stopped working, they started covering themselves in the blood and body parts of our fallen soldiers. Our own dead became their camouflage. Beltanos felt sick at this description, but she said nothing. When we sent armored vehicles to hunt them, they dug pits and filled them with sharpened stakes. Primitive traps that should not have worked against advanced technology. But our vehicles were not designed for such threats. We lost dozens of them before we understood what was happening. Krixmar described the human tunnel networks. Within weeks of the invasion, the colonists had dug hundreds of kilometers of underground passages. They lived down there in the darkness, coming up only to fight. We tried to collapse the tunnels with explosives. They simply dug new ones. We tried to flood them with poison gas. They built ventilation systems that sent the gas back at us. We tried to send our soldiers down into the tunnels to fight them directly. He stopped speaking for a moment, and his eye closed. That was our worst mistake. The tunnels were death traps. The humans knew every turn, every hidden room, every ambush point. Our soldiers would go down in squads of 20. Sometimes 1 or 2 would come back. Usually none. The old commander spoke of the psychological effects on his troops. The Selenari were proud warriors, but they had never faced an enemy like this. My soldiers stopped sleeping. They heard sounds in the darkness. They saw shadows moving where nothing was there. Every rustle of wind, every creak of metal, every distant noise made them jump. They began to crack. Strong warriors who had fought in dozens of campaigns began to break down. He described soldiers who refused to leave their quarters at night. Officers who became so paranoid they shot at their own troops. Entire units that had to be relieved because they could no longer function. The humans did not just fight us. They got inside our heads. They made us afraid of the dark. They made us afraid of silence. They made us afraid of our own shadows. Krixmar spoke of the day he finally understood what the humans were doing. A captured human fighter, badly wounded but still alive, had been brought to him for questioning. I asked him why they kept fighting. They were outnumbered, outgunned. They had no chance of winning. Any logical species would have surrendered by then. Why did they keep resisting? The old soldier's voice grew quiet. He looked at me with those strange human eyes and said something I will never forget. He said, "We are not fighting to win. We are fighting to make you pay such a terrible price that you will never want to do this again. Every one of us who dies will take 10 of you with us. And when your empire counts the cost, you will understand that some worlds are not worth conquering." Krixmar shook his head slowly. I thought he was exaggerating. I thought it was just bravado. But by the end of the campaign, his words proved true. We conquered Kepler-4 We won that battle. But the price was so high that our emperor himself began to question whether the war should continue. He looked at Voltanos with his scarred face. We landed 50,000 soldiers on that world. 8 months later, only 11,000 walked away. 39,000 of our best warriors died fighting farmers and shopkeepers. And Patricia Cole, the ghost of Kepler, escaped with the last human survivors. She went on to fight in 17 more battles before the war ended. The old commander fell silent for a moment. That was when I first began to understand what we had awakened. That was when I first began to feel real fear. But Kepler-4 was just the beginning. The humans were only getting started. Voltanos refilled Krixmar's water glass and waited for him to continue. The old soldier drank slowly, gathering his thoughts. When he spoke again, his voice carried a strange mixture of fear and respect. After Kepler-4 our strategists conducted a complete analysis of humanity. We needed to understand what made them so different from every other species we had conquered. We studied their history, their biology, their culture. What we found terrified us. The historian leaned forward, her recording devices capturing every word. Humans evolved on a world that tried to kill them every single day. Their planet, Earth, is what we call a death world. Most intelligent species develop on relatively peaceful planets. Stable climates. Few predators. Abundant resources. Earth was nothing like that. Krixmar described the human homeworld in detail. Extreme temperatures that could freeze or burn an unprotected being. Violent storms that could destroy entire cities. Earthquakes that shattered the ground. Floods that drowned vast regions. Volcanoes that buried civilizations under ash and fire. And the predators, he continued, shaking his head. Earth was filled with creatures that hunted humans. Great cats with claws that could tear through metal. Bears that stood twice the height of a man. Wolves that hunted in packs. Sharks that ruled the oceans. Venomous snakes and spiders. Creatures that could kill with a single bite or sting. He looked at Voltanos with his remaining eye. Any other species would have been destroyed by such a world. Any other species would have gone extinct long before developing intelligence. But humans did not just survive. They conquered. They hunted their predators until many went extinct. They built shelters that could withstand the worst storms. They created medicines to fight the diseases that plagued them. The old commander's voice grew heavy with meaning. Do you understand what this means? Humans did not evolve in safety. They evolved in constant danger. Their entire existence was a war for survival. Fighting is not something they learned. It is something written into their very blood. He spoke of a human medic named Christopher Santos who had been captured during the second year of the war. Santos had been badly wounded in battle, and the Selenari believed he would be easy to break. We held him for 3 weeks, Krixmar said quietly. 3 weeks of interrogation. We wanted tactical information, troop positions, supply routes, defense plans, simple things that any prisoner would eventually reveal. The old soldier paused, and something like respect entered his voice. Christopher Santos told us nothing. We used every technique in our protocols. Physical pressure, psychological manipulation, threats against his family. Nothing worked. He simply refused to break. Voltanos asked what happened to the human medic. He escaped, Krixmar replied simply, from a maximum security detention facility, a facility that had held prisoners from 37 conquered species. None had ever escaped. but Christopher Santos did. The old commander described how the escape happened. Santos had hidden a small piece of metal inside his own body, swallowing it before capture. After 3 weeks, he retrieved it and used it to pick the locks on his cell. But that was not the remarkable part, Krixmar continued. The ventilation shafts in our facility were designed to be too narrow for any prisoner to crawl through. We had measured the dimensions carefully. No Selenari or any other known species could fit. He shuddered at the memory. Christopher Santos dislocated both of his shoulders. Deliberately, intentionally, he pulled his own joints out of their sockets to make his body narrow enough to fit through the shafts. Then, after crawling for nearly an hour, he reset his shoulders himself and continued moving. Veltanos felt her stomach turn at this description. He killed 11 guards during his escape. 11 trained soldiers, armed and armored, against 1 wounded human with nothing but a piece of metal. When we found the bodies, some of my officers could not believe what they saw. They thought Santos must have had help, that someone must have smuggled weapons to him. But the security recordings showed the truth. He did it alone. With his bare hands and a scrap of metal, Krixmar fell silent for a moment, remembering. I was the one who reviewed those recordings. I watched Christopher Santos crawl through those shafts with his shoulders destroyed. I watched him reset his own bones without making a sound. I watched him kill my soldiers with cold precision. And I asked myself a question that haunts me to this day. What question? Veltanos asked softly. What kind of evolution creates beings willing to destroy their own bodies to continue fighting? What kind of survival pressure produces that level of determination? What kind of species looks at unbearable pain and says, "This is acceptable. This is the price. I will pay it." The old soldier shook his head slowly. That was when I truly began to understand humans. They are not brave in the way we think of bravery. They are not strong in the way we measure strength. They are something else entirely. Something that our empire had never faced before. He spoke of other incidents that demonstrated the human capacity for endurance. A pilot named Laura Bennett, who continued flying her damaged ship after losing her left arm. A soldier named Kevin Murray, who walked 30 kilometers through frozen wilderness with severe frostbite to deliver critical intelligence. A scientist named Maria Reyes, who stayed behind on a doomed space station to ensure her colleagues could escape, knowing she would die. We studied these cases. Hundreds of them. Thousands. We tried to find a pattern. We tried to understand what made humans willing to sacrifice themselves in ways that no other species would consider. Krixmar looked directly at the historian. Do you know what we discovered? Humans are social creatures. They form deep bonds with each other, families, friends, communities, and when those bonds are threatened, something changes in them. They stop caring about their own survival. They only care about protecting the ones they love. He described a human concept that the Selenari had no word for. The humans called it sacrifice. The willingness to give up everything, including life itself, for something greater. A Selenari soldier fights for glory, for honor, for advancement in our social hierarchy. When the battle becomes hopeless, we retreat. We preserve ourselves. We live to fight another day. This is logical. This is rational. The old commander's voice grew quiet. Humans are different. When the battle becomes hopeless, they fight harder. When there is no chance of victory, they look for ways to make their deaths meaningful. They do not retreat. They do not surrender. They find something worth dying for, and then they die for it. He spoke of a human saying that had been found among captured documents. A simple phrase that summarized everything the Selenari had learned about their enemy. The humans have a proverb. No one is coming to save you. Save yourself. This is how they think. This is how they are raised. They do not wait for rescue. They do not hope for mercy. They take responsibility for their own survival. And they fight until they cannot fight anymore. Krixmar finished his water and set the glass aside. By the 3rd year of the war, our entire empire was committed to the conflict. We had conquered 37 species with ease. But humanity was different. Humanity was a species forged in fire, shaped by constant struggle. hardened by millions of years of fighting for survival on a world that wanted them dead. He looked at Veltanos with something like admiration. In his scarred face, we had made the mistake of giving them a reason to fight. We had threatened their homes, their families, their future. We had awakened something that should have been left sleeping, and now we were going to pay the price. The recording chamber seemed to grow colder as Krixmar continued his testimony. The old soldier was deep in his memories now, reliving battles that had shaped the fate of two civilizations. By the 4th year of the war, everything had changed, he said quietly. We had expected a quick conquest, a simple addition to our empire. Instead, we found ourselves fighting for our very survival. Voltanos checked her recording equipment and nodded for him to continue. The humans learned our technology faster than we believed possible. Much faster. A human engineer named Linda Morrison became famous among our intelligence officers. She had been captured early in the war and escaped 3 months later. We did not realize until much later what she had accomplished during her captivity. Krixmar described how Linda Morrison had studied every piece of Selenari technology she could access. Shield generators, weapon systems, navigation computers. She memorized everything, hiding her observations in a code that her captors could not detect. Within 6 months of her escape, human ships were using improved versions of our own shields. Our weapons, which had been superior to theirs in every way, were suddenly matched, then surpassed. Linda Morrison had not just copied our technology. She had understood it deeply enough to make it better. The old commander spoke with grudging respect. She was not the only one. Hundreds of human engineers and scientists were working on captured Selenari equipment. They shared information through networks we could not break. They collaborated across light years of space, and they improved faster than we could adapt. He described the shift in the war. For the first 3 years, the Selenari had been the aggressors. They had attacked human worlds, captured human colonies, and pushed humanity back toward their home system. But in the 4th year, the tide began to turn. Humans stopped defending. They started attacking. Their fleets, once weak and scattered, became coordinated strike forces. They hit our supply lines, our communication relays, our shipyards. They struck where we were weakest, then disappeared before we could respond. Krixmar spoke of the Battle of the Oronex Nebula, a conflict that became legendary in Selenari military history. A human fleet led by Admiral Gregory Dunn had engaged a Selenari armada nearly twice its size. Admiral Dunn was not like other human commanders, the old soldier said slowly. Most human officers fought with caution, protecting their ships and crews. Dunn fought with something else. Calculation. Cold, precise calculation. He described the battle in detail. The Selenari fleet had trapped the human forces against the dense gases of the nebula. There was no escape. Admiral Dunn's ships were outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded. We expected surrender, or at least retreat. The humans had fought their way out of impossible situations before, but this time there was no way out. Our commanders were already discussing terms for their capture. Krixmar's voice grew quiet. Admiral Dunn did something we never anticipated. Something no Selenari commander would ever consider. He flew his flagship, the Resolute Hope, directly into the center of our formation. Straight at our command ship. The old soldier paused, remembering the chaos of that moment. We fired everything we had at him. Hundreds of weapons hitting his ship at once. The Resolute Hope should have been destroyed in seconds. But the humans had reinforced their shields in ways we did not understand. They had channeled all their power to the front of the ship. They absorbed our attacks and kept coming. He described the final moments of the battle. Admiral Dunn's ship, burning and breaking apart, crashed directly into the Selenari command vessel. The explosion was so massive that it destroyed both ships and damaged everything within 1,000 kilometers. Admiral Dunn died instantly. So did his entire crew of 437 humans. They knew they would die. They flew into that battle knowing there was no survival, and they did it anyway. Krixmar shook his head in disbelief, even after all these years. With our command ship destroyed, our fleet fell into chaos. Our commanders were dead. Our communication systems were scrambled, and the rest of the human fleet attacked while we were still trying to understand what had happened. The old soldier described the aftermath. The Selenari lost over 60% of their ships in the following hours. The surviving vessels retreated in disorder, pursued by human fighters who showed no mercy. We had never seen anything like it. A commander sacrificing himself and his entire crew for victory. In Selenari culture, this would be considered madness, waste. Our officers valued their lives above all else. A commander who died in battle was a commander who could not lead future campaigns. He looked at Veltanos with something like wonder in his remaining eye. But humans think differently. Admiral Dunn calculated the value of his own life against the lives that would be saved by destroying our command ship. He weighed his 437 crew members against the thousands who would die if the battle was lost. And he found the trade acceptable. Krixmar spoke of the effect this battle had on the Selenari military. The shock was profound. Their entire understanding of warfare had been based on predictable behavior. Enemies would act in their own self-interest. They would retreat when outnumbered. They would surrender when defeat was certain. Humans broke all our rules. They did not fight for self-preservation. They fought for something larger, something we could not calculate or predict, and that made them terrifying. The turning point of the war came shortly after the Battle of Oranax Nebula. The humans stopped fighting just to defend their own territory. They began pushing into Selenari space, attacking worlds that had been safe for centuries. They could have negotiated peace, Krixmar said bitterly. They could have secured their borders and stopped. They had proven they could not be conquered. That should have been enough. He fell silent for a moment, then continued. But the humans did not stop. They had learned about the other species we had enslaved. The 37 civilizations living under our rule, and something in the human character could not accept this. They decided to free them all. The old soldier described human soldiers landing on conquered worlds, not as conquerors but as liberators. They brought weapons. For the enslaved populations, they trained resistance fighters. They provided medical care and food. Species that had been under our control for centuries suddenly had hope. They had seen humans fighting against impossible odds and winning. They began to believe that freedom was possible. Krixmar spoke of the Verdani, a species conquered by the Selenari over 500 years before. Human soldiers had made contact with Verdani rebels and promised them support. A human captain named Nathan Clark led the mission to arm the Verdani resistance. He was young, barely an adult by human standards. But he understood something that our empire had forgotten. Oppressed people will fight if they believe they can win. Captain Clark spent 8 months on the Verdani homeworld, living among the rebels, teaching them tactics, sharing human technology. When the Selenari sent a pacification fleet, the Verdani were ready. They destroyed our fleet using weapons and strategies the humans had taught them. For the first time in 500 years, Verdani ships flew freely in their own space. And Captain Clark was there, standing beside them, celebrating their victory as if it were his own. Krixmar shook his head slowly. This was what we could not understand. The humans gained nothing from freeing the Verdani. There was no profit, no territory, no strategic advantage. They did it simply because they believed it was right. He looked at the historian with his scarred face. That is what makes humanity truly dangerous. They fight for ideas, for principles, for beliefs that cannot be measured or calculated. You cannot negotiate with such enemies. You cannot predict them. You can only hope that their principles lead them toward mercy rather than revenge. The old soldier fell silent for a long moment, gathering his strength for the final part of his story. By the end of the 4th year, the Selenari Empire was crumbling. Species we had controlled for centuries were rising up. Our fleets were scattered and weakened. Our emperor, for the first time in the history of our civilization, was considering surrender. Krixmar closed his remaining eye, and the humans kept coming. They would not stop until every chain was broken, until every slave was free, until our empire was nothing but a memory. The recording chamber was silent as Krixmar gathered himself for the final part of his testimony. Veltanos could see the weight of decades pressing down on the old soldier. These were memories he had carried alone for a very long time. The human wars ended with the complete dissolution of the Selenari Empire. He began, his voice heavy with the pain of defeat. Everything our civilization had built over 3,000 years of conquest was dismantled in less than 5 years of fighting. 37 conquered species gained their freedom. Our military was destroyed. Our emperor fled into exile. He paused, his remaining eye focused on something only he could see. I was one of the officers chosen to sign the surrender documents. It was considered a great dishonor, a punishment for my failures during the war. But looking back now, I understand that it was also a gift. It allowed me to see something that changed my understanding of humanity forever. Krixmar described the surrender ceremony held aboard a human diplomatic vessel in neutral space. The Selenari delegation had expected anger, hatred, demands for revenge. After all, the war had cost millions of lives on both sides. The human delegation was led by Admiral Catherine Dunn. She was the daughter of Gregory Dunn, the commander who had sacrificed himself at the Battle of Onyx Nebula. I had killed thousands of her people. I had been part of the force that made her father's death necessary. The old soldier's voice grew quiet. I expected her to hate me. I expected to see satisfaction in her eyes as I signed the documents that ended my empire. I was prepared for insults, for contempt, for the cold triumph of a victor over the vanquished. He stopped speaking for a moment, and when he continued, there was wonder in his voice. Instead, she shook my hand. She looked at me with those strange human eyes, and she said she hoped our species could build something better together. Not as conqueror and conquered, but as neighbors, as partners, perhaps in time as friends. Krixmar shook his head slowly, even now unable to fully understand what had happened. I did not know how to respond. In Selenari culture, a defeated enemy is humiliated, punished, made to feel the full weight of their failure. The victors take everything they can. This is how war has always worked. This is how power operates. He looked at Veltanos directly. But the humans did something different. They had won completely. They had the power to destroy what remained of our civilization. They could have enslaved us as we had enslaved others. They could have taken revenge for every colony we had bombed, every soldier we had killed, every atrocity we had committed. The old soldier's voice cracked with emotion. They chose. Say mercy instead. They helped us rebuild. They provided food and medicine when our people were starving. They sent engineers to repair our cities and scientists to restore our technology. They treated us not as defeated enemies, but as neighbors who had made terrible mistakes. He described the years following the surrender. Human ambassadors worked patiently with Selenari leaders to establish new forms of government. Human educators helped transition Selenari society from a culture of conquest to a culture of cooperation. There were those among my people who could not accept this mercy. They saw it as weakness. They plotted to rebuild our military and resume the war. They believed that humanity would eventually show its true nature, that the kindness was just a trap. Krixmar smiled sadly. They were wrong. The humans knew about these plots. Their intelligence services had penetrated every level of our remaining government. They could have crushed the resistance before it began. Instead, they waited. They gave the plotters time to see that peace was possible. And slowly, one by one, even the hardest hearts among us began to change. He spoke of a human diplomat named Samuel Porter, who had spent 10 years living among the Selenari, learning their language, studying their culture, trying to build bridges between the two species. Samuel Porter became my friend, the first human I ever truly knew outside of combat. He taught me many things about his species, their history, their values, their hopes for the future. The old soldier's voice grew warm with memory. He told me once that humans had a long history of warfare among themselves, terrible wars that killed millions of their own kind. Wars fought over land, resources, religion, ideology. Every generation seemed to bring new conflicts. Krixmar paused, remembering the conversation. I asked him how his species survived such constant violence, how they did not destroy themselves completely. And he said something that I think about every day. Veltanos leaned forward. What did he say? He said that humans have two sides to their nature. One side is capable of terrible violence, cruelty, destruction. This side has caused suffering beyond measure throughout their history. But the other side is equally powerful. It is the side that looks at enemies and sees potential friends, that looks at destruction and imagines rebuilding, that looks at hatred and chooses love instead. The old soldier's remaining eye glistened with moisture. He said that every human carries both sides within them. Every day, they must choose which side to listen to, and the measure of their civilization is which side they choose most often. Krixmar described watching humanity in the decades since the war. He had seen them face new challenges, new enemies, new opportunities for conquest. Each time, they had chosen the difficult path of peace over the easy path of violence. They are not perfect. No species is. They still fight among themselves sometimes. They still make mistakes. They still struggle with the darkness in their nature. But they keep trying. They keep choosing to be better than they have to be. The old soldier looked at the historian with something approaching reverence in his scarred face. That is what makes them truly terrifying. Historian Veltanos, not their weapons, not their technology, not their determination to fight until the last one of them falls. What makes them terrifying is their choice. He leaned forward, his voice intense, yet every reason to become monsters. Their evolution shaped them for violence. Their history was written in blood. When they faced our empire, they could have become worse than we ever were. They had the strength, the cunning, the sheer determination to become the greatest conquerors the galaxy has ever seen. Krixmar paused, letting his words sink in. Instead, they chose compassion. They chose mercy. They chose to be protectors rather than predators. And they make that choice every single day, fighting against their own nature, their own history, their own instincts. The old soldier stood slowly, his ancient body protesting the movement. He looked around the recording chamber one last time, knowing that his testimony would be preserved for future generations. This is my message to the young races. Never mistake human kindness for weakness. They are kind because they choose to be, not because they must be. Every human you meet is fighting a battle inside themselves between darkness and light. And most of the time, the light wins. He moved toward the door, then stopped and turned back. But never forget what they are capable of when the darkness wins instead. Never forget what they did to my empire when we threatened their homes and families. Never forget the determination that allowed them to fight against impossible odds and win. Krixmar's final words were spoken softly, almost to himself. I pray the galaxy never gives humanity a reason to choose differently. I pray we never see what they would become if they stopped fighting the darkness inside themselves. Because I have seen the fires that burn within the human soul. And I know that if those fires were ever fully unleashed, nothing in this galaxy could stand against them. He looked at Veltanos one last time. Remember this. Remember what I have told you. And pray that humanity continues to choose mercy. For if they ever choose otherwise, there will be no force in the universe that can stop them. The old soldier turned and walked slowly out of the recording chamber, carrying 40 years of memories with him. Veltanos sat in silence for a long time after he left, thinking about everything she had heard. Then she began to prepare her testimony for the Galactic Archive. The younger races needed to understand. They needed to know the truth about humanity. They needed to know what those strange, fragile, impossible creatures were truly capable of, and they needed to understand why the veterans still flinched. When they saw human faces smiling at them across diplomatic tables, some lessons, once learned, could never be forgotten.